All right, good afternoon. I see Volker on the screen. If we can just put him up on the big screen in the room. Volker, can you hear us?
I can hear you well.
Perfect.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Great. So, as you all know, we've asked Volker Perthes, our special representative for Sudan and head of the UN Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Khartoum, to join us. He will brief you virtually from Khartoum. Then after that, I will brief, and then we will then be joined by Achim Steiner, the administrator for UNDP, and he will brief you on UNDP's People's Climate Vote. Before we turn it over to Khartoum, I want to read a statement from the Secretary General, in which the Secretary General strongly condemns the ongoing military coup d'etat in Khartoum and all actions that could jeopardize Sudan's political transition and stability. The Secretary General calls for the immediate reconstitution of the governing arrangements provided under the constitutional document. The unlawful detention of the Prime Minister, government officials, and politicians is unacceptable and contravenes the constitutional document and the partnership critical for the success of Sudan's transition. The Secretary General calls on the immediate release of the Prime Minister and all others who have been detained immediately. Sudanese stakeholders must immediately return to dialogue and engage in good faith to restore the constitutional order and Sudan's transitional process. The United Nations reiterates its unwavering commitment and support to the realization of Sudan's political transition. Any attempt to undermine the transition process puts at risk Sudan's security, stability, and development. The United Nations will continue to stand with the people of Sudan as they strive to fulfill their aspirations for a peaceful, prosperous, and democratic future. So that is a statement from the Secretary General, and now I'm very glad to hand it over to our special representative in Khartoum. Volker, please, you have the floor, and then we'll take a few questions.
Well, thank you very much, Stefan. Good afternoon, colleagues. I guess you are following what is happening here in Sudan. The situation is still fluid, and we are not able to ascertain all the reports which we are getting. But what we know is that the army this morning has detained, or first put under house arrest, Prime Minister Hamdok, and then reportedly brought him and his wife to an unknown destination or unknown location after he reportedly refused to dissolve the government. That had been a demand from the military for a couple of days. Also, other government officials, including the Minister of Cabinet Affairs, the Minister of Information, the Minister of Industry, and a couple of others have been arrested, and we don't know where they are. The same applies to some members from the Sovereign Council, as well as some journalists. In a statement at noon today, General Brough, so far the head of the Sovereignty Council and the head of the armed forces, has declared a state of emergency. He further declared the dissolution of the Sovereignty Council, the collective head of state as it is, and the Council of Ministers, the cabinet, the dismissal of all state governors, the freezing of the work of the so-called dismantling committee that is looking into the corruption under the old regime, which fell 2 years ago. He also announced the suspension of several constitutional provisions. And at the same time, he stated that the armed forces are adhering to the constitutional document of 2019, as well as to the Juba Peace Agreement of 2020, that a technocratic cabinet will be established, and that a parliament and other key institutions will be set up before the end of November this year. He also indicated or said rather clearly that the military would hand over power to an elected civilian government, and that elections for that purpose would be held in July 2023. This morning, the army took control of Khartoum, closing the entrances and the bridges and closing down the airport and also taking control of state TV. Then quite a number of Sudanese parties and unions came out condemning the coup, asking people to take to the streets, and indeed thousands, as to our estimates, have been protesting in Khartoum as well as all over the cities of the country, condemning the action of the military and demanding a return to civilian government. Some demonstrators earlier this day tried to enter army headquarters here in Khartoum. We have then seen shooting and injuries, but can't confirm any details. Let me say that over the past 4 weeks or so, I've been shuttling between the different political and military actors here in Khartoum, urging dialogue, the maintenance of the constitutional partnership, and warning everybody not to squander the achievements of the first 2 years of the transition period. Today, I'm demanding from everybody to exercise utmost restraint. I'm calling on the military to release all those that were unlawfully detained today. And I'm asking all stakeholders to return to dialogue and restore the constitutional order, as well as not to put domestic peace and political transition at risk. As UNITAMS, as the United Nations Interim Transition Assistance Mission, we stand ready, of course, to further support the country on its path towards domestic peace and political transition. Thank you very much, Stefan, colleagues.
Well, I know you have time. You don't have very much time, so we'll take a few questions. Edie Leder, Associated Press.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perthes. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, thank you for doing this on short notice. A couple of questions. First, how involved was the UN with the U.S. envoy Jeffrey Feltman in actually trying to get the military to back down from this coup? And secondly, what do you believe the implications will be for the economy, the humanitarian situation, and is there anything other than statements that you believe the international community can do to try and reverse the coup? Thank you.
Stefan, should I go directly or do
Go ahead. Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you. We have not been directly involved with the U.S. Special Envoy's efforts. He has had his meetings. We have had almost parallel meetings with the same stakeholders in the same couple of last days, very much trying to do the same, that is, telling everybody that a military coup would not serve the country well. At the same time, also urging some of the civilian or party political representatives that they need to accept dialogue formats that had been had been established by Prime Minister Hamdok. But of course, the main thrust of our attempts to prevent a coup was with the military. As to the effects on the economy and the humanitarian situation, it is way too early to tell. Now, it is interesting that General Brough today, as one of the reasons for the need, as he said, for the army to act, also cited the dire economic situation, which has been severely impacted in the last 4 weeks through the closure of the Port Sudan, and the main road leading from Port Sudan to Khartoum and the rest of the country. Now, we have heard today, and again, I cannot ascertain details, that the tribal leader, Nasser Tirik, who has been maintaining this closure of support, has welcomed the coup in Khartoum and promised to lift the closure. So that might then immediately lead to some economic relief, humanitarian situation. It's more a long-term thing, and I don't think the international community will let up their humanitarian support to Sudan, which is indeed very, very necessary. Are there other means and statements? Well, certainly for member states, there are others, and I do understand that the US Special Envoy has alluded to other means by member states. The United Nations is not a stick-wielding organization, as you know, but we can definitely, and also this is more than statements, try to and offer to mediate, to bring parties together, which will have to happen once things calm down. And of course, there are voices from both sides of the political spectrum who are saying that the United Nations should have a role here in bringing parties together to one table and try to lay out the roadmap for what remains of, hopefully, a transitional period.
Thank you, Steph. Thank you. My name is Ibtisam Azim from Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. So first, could you please give us an update, even if it's a short one, about the humanitarian situation in Sudan and in general? And then also, how worried are you that the situation could escalate to a civil war or even if you could, have you been in contact with Mr. Burhan or any of the military personnel since the announcement? Can you move freely? Thank you.
Well, a lot of questions. The humanitarian situation, as said, has not changed from yesterday to today. We have more than half of the population in Sudan that needs some form of humanitarian support, food aid, or others. And this, of course, will not immediately change into one direction or the other. We have had a deterioration, particularly in the east and in the west, that is Darfur. But also we are seeing shortages, have been seeing shortages of bread and other supply here in Khartoum since the closure of the port. So if the closure is lifted within the next day or two, we will see a bit of relief. I'm not restricted from traveling, but many streets are simply closed through demonstrations and roadblocks set up by the so-called resistance committees or other societal actors or simply angry youth on the street. So it is not advisable to move around. I have not, to answer your last question, I have not seen any of the military leaders today. I guess I will see them in the next couple of days. Today it is very, very difficult to reach anybody since internet and telephone lines are down.
Just a follow-up about the contact to the military. You said you didn't see anybody, but were you, as the UN, able to be in contact with the military leadership? And secondly, you described like the airport being seized and bridges. It seems to be a tight grip. As of now, do you think the coup has to be seen as successful?
Well, whether the coup is successful or not, I think is a question that history will answer or give an answer to after a couple of years. But if your question is whether it seems that the military is in control, my answer would be yes, with all the caveats that we don't have a full overview given the lack of phone connections or internet access. And your first question, I think, was about contact with the military. My last contact was one of the military leaders in the Sovereign Council was last afternoon.
Thank you. We'll go.
Yesterday late afternoon, I'm sorry.
Thank you. We'll go to the screen. Michelle Nichols at Reuters. Michelle.
Thank you, Special Envoy, for doing this. Just a couple of quick follow-up questions. You mentioned that you met with the military leaders yesterday afternoon. Did you get any indication from them that this was coming? Is there any idea what the specific trigger for this was? Why did they choose to do it now after all this sort of flurry of diplomatic activity? What signs did you see that this was coming? Thanks.
Well, we heard military leaders increase their criticism of the civilian part of the government, including, which they had done in the weeks before, of Prime Minister Hamdok, but particularly their criticism was directed against what they call the party politicians that, in their reading, were dominating the government, the civilian part of the government, the cabinet, as it were. Actually, we had a talk with the military leader I spoke to yesterday, about the need for us, for the United Nations, to bring people to the table. He indicated on my question that the military would be prepared to respond to an invitation to dialogue at the table of the United Nations, and that said dialogue would be favorable, much favorable to any military action. But yes, he also indicated that the military might move, of course, as other envoys in the days before. I strongly warned against doing this.
Thank you. We'll go to Pam Falk at CBS News. Pam.
Yes, thank you, Special Envoy, for the briefing. A follow-up on the last question on the military. When was the last time you met with them? There were reports that the U.S. envoy Jeffrey Feltman met with them a day or two ago. Were there specific indications that this would happen and that they were threatening it would happen? And on Darfur, can you give any specifics about what the state of economics and the impact of the coup in Darfur? And the final one is just how many UN staff are there? Thank you so much.
Well, look, to your first question, I think I already answered that. My last contact with one of the military leaders was yesterday late afternoon. The US Special Envoy, I think, had left by that time. He had a meeting with President of the Sovereignty Council Burhan, the Prime Minister, and the RSF leader and Vice President of the Sovereignty Council, Hemeti, on Saturday. As far as I know, I had last met President Burhan on Thursday last week. So yes, we have all been in close contact with both the civilian and the military leaders. But obviously our attempts to urge everybody to get back to dialogue and to initiate that dialogue were not successful. As to Darfur, for now, what I hear from our office is that we have no immediate impact of the situation here in Khartoum on Darfur. But again, Darfur has about the size of France. UNITAMS has about 30 personnel there, so I cannot really cover the area and tell you exactly what is going on, given again the lack of phone connections, internet connections, and other reliable information. The one sort of slightly reassuring fact which we witnessed today was that the Permanent Ceasefire Committee for Darfur which is chaired by UNITAMS, by my mission, did meet today with the representatives of the armed forces, the regular armed forces, and the representatives of the so-called peace partners or the signatories to the Juba Peace Agreement. And of course, it is our interest to maintain business as usual in that ceasefire committee in order to stabilize or continue to stabilize the situation in Darfur to the extent that this is possible by maintaining such an institution. We have also seen from other parts of the country, like from the east, where we did have a mission in the last couple of days to help mediate between the tribal leader there and the government, who wanted the port to be opened, that the local security committee is doing their work and escorting both UN personnel as well as ministers who, according to General Burhan's statement, are no longer ministers, to escorting them back to Khartoum. Our own staff, it's a very, very limited mission, a very small mission that we have here, UNITAMS. We have, for today, approximately 130 staff, altogether UN staff in the country. That includes the country team, is in the low number of, in the low 4-digit number.
Thank you. We'll take one more question from the screen, then we'll go back to the room for a few last questions. Margaret Bashir, Voice of America. Maggie?
Thank you for doing the briefing. Mr. Perthes, can you just address the security councils in the region? Could a visit by them do anything to help the situation at all? And I think you might have missed Ibtisam's question about the violence deteriorating. Are you concerned it could deteriorate to a civil war sort of situation, anyway, internal armed conflict, because the protesters are so adamant that they don't want this military coup to succeed? And do you have anything on curfews? Is there a curfew or anything going on? Are the streets calm now? Can you? I know it's evening there. If you could just give us a little color about how it is now from your perch. Thanks.
Well, happy to work as a correspondent for your network, but look, no, I did not miss the question of Ibtisam. I simply didn't want to answer it because I think that is too speculative. And of course, I leave the predictions about the future to those whose business that is, not mine. So my job and that of the United Nations and other diplomats is try to prevent exactly what Ibtisam was asking for in her question. So I would not predict anything in that direction and thereby sort of predetermine the circumstances under which I work. If I look out of the window, and indeed it is getting dark, we still have barricades burning, and we can hear occasional gunshots. So of course there is a risk that there would be more violence or more clashes when night falls, and there would be very, very little means for us to have any influence on that, aside from, as one of your colleagues asked earlier, aside from statements to exercise restraint. There was a third question you had, but this I probably really missed. It was not that I didn't want to.
Did you answer on the Security Council there in the region? I'm not sure.
Exactly. To be honest, the Security Council can always be of help if it is united. So I guess we will have a briefing to the Security Council tomorrow. And if the unity which has been maintained on Sudan for the last 2 years in the Security Council, in contrast to divisions which we have seen on other countries in the region like Libya or Syria, if that unity is maintained, I think it does indeed help because the actors here do take international opinion quite seriously, and particularly statements from the Security Council. The delegation that is now in the region in Mali, actually the continent is too big that we would say they could have a direct impact or bearing on what is happening here in Sudan.
Thank you. We'll just take a handful more questions. Dulcie Lembach. Dulcie, pass blue.
Hi, thanks very much. I wanted to go back to the Jeffrey Felton issue. Do you anticipate talking to him about the situation? I think you said you're not sure if he's still in Sudan, but where do you see the UN working with the U.S. envoy on the coup? Thanks.
I have been talking to Jeff Feltman when he was here, as I'm talking to basically any high-ranking international visitor that comes through Khartoum, and I will continue to do that. But I'm not going to give you my diary for tomorrow or whom I'm going to speak to. But Jeff Feltman is no longer in Sudan.
Thank you. We'll take two more questions. Philippe Rater, AFP. And then
Thank you for the briefing. Can you tell us a little bit about your analysis about the position of the country in the region? For example, do you think Egypt and the President Sisi can be a key to resolve the situation? Thank you.
I would love it that if you ask that question to the Egyptian leadership. We have heard different statements from regional stakeholders, and it seems to me that the regional stakeholders are much more cautious in their statements than Europeans or Americans are, for that matter. Egypt, for example, said that it has a, I'm paraphrasing, I don't know exactly, but they said they have a key interest in stability and security of Sudan. So I think for the neighbors, the question of stability of Sudan's borders, Sudan not getting in new domestic strife is much more important than who actually runs the country from Khartoum. But what exactly their contribution could be, this should be answered from the regional capitals. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question, Joe Klein. And
Yes, Joseph Klein, Canada Free Press. I'm not sure you want to answer this question either, but the question deals with the security for the mission, the UN mission itself, whether you were presently comfortable with whatever security arrangements are now in place, and are you relying primarily on the Sudan military forces or police for such security? Thank you.
Well, that's a question I'm happy to respond to, Mr. Klein. No, we are comfortable. What we are seeing here, and that has been indicated in the last couple of weeks, is a conflict between Sudanese stakeholders. It is not a conflict between Sudanese stakeholders and any part of the international community. And we have seen, even when tensions were building up with the mass demonstrations that we have seen here on Thursday, if I'm sitting in a UN car with a UN flag or a UN logo on the car, people are happy to wave me through, and that goes both for demonstrators blocking the road and for the military if I want to visit any of the government institutions. We are protected by the Sudanese police, by the diplomatic police, and we feel comfortable with that indeed. Thank you.
great. Thank you, Volker. We cannot thank you enough for making yourself available on very short notice. And you are hired as a correspondent for the media here. But in all seriousness, thank you very much. Please pass on our thanks and solidarity to you and all the colleagues in the mission.
My pleasure. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you.